This extracurricular was rejected to all 30 schools he applied to. This extracurricular earned interviews at Mayo, Einstein, and Kaiser. But this one earned an interview at Stanford. Today, I'll break down 4 clinical experiences with 4 drastically different results. We'll learn about what makes a strong clinical experience, what makes a weak clinical experience, and how to best write about them. Extracurricular number 1, clinical research assistant for the student stroke team, rejected to 30 plus medical schools. Simple works and fancy hurts. There are 2 dangerous ways that Premeds fool themselves into writing strong extracurriculars when in reality they've done the opposite. First of all, fancy niche jargon like last known wellness and symptom onset. This is just stroke terminology that would not be very familiar to your, say, endocrinologist. And second, we have sweeping broad statements like interpreted imaging results inform diagnoses. What does that actually mean? Or things like implement the latest medical advances. What medical advances to improve patient outcomes? What patient outcomes? It's just far too broad to be helpful. Both of those examples leave the reader thinking, well, what exactly did you mean by that? And both are fancy ways of hiding the fact that that extracurricular wasn't strong enough or that the writer didn't spend enough time reflecting on why that extracurricular was important. The quality of a work and activity section is dictated only by 2 factors. Number 1 is the quality of the extracurricular itself, and number 2 is how you write about that extracurricular. You want a high quality extracurricular that you write exceptionally well. And you certainly don't want to be on the other end where you have a low quality extracurricular that you write poorly. And of course, these 2 factors interact with each other. If your extracurricular is low quality, there is a ceiling on how well you can write about it. The maxim to remember here is that you cannot turn chicken shit into chicken salad. Conversely, it's very difficult to turn chicken salad into chicken shit. Let me give you an example. If your extracurricular is exceptional, or chicken salad, say like you built out the biochemistry arm of Khan Academy, and every year you get 10 million plus views on your section of that website. That chicken salad is impossible to write poorly. So remember, if you're in the application cycle, you can't change the inherent quality of your extracurricular. All you can do is figure out how to write it better, which we'll talk about in the next coming extracurriculars. But if you're not applying and you still have 9 months to 3 or 4 years before your application cycle, focus on maximizing the quality of your experience so that writing becomes that much easier. Now, we're privileged here because we can run a very cool experiment with that last stroke team extracurricular. What would it look like if we took that exact same extracurricular and just wrote it 100 times better? Would this Premed's admissions odds change? Well, we can run a pseudo experiment because that exact same extracurricular, those same 408 hours were represented again in the next cycle the following year. And spoiler alert, the changes he made are a big reason that he went from being rejected to 30 plus medical schools to being accepted to the competitive medical school in California, UCI. So here is that same extracurricular the next year. And instead of having responsibilities back to back to back, you're now going to see that actual patient stories dominate the written experience. Look at this panel of patients, the patients that comes in with Broca's aphasia, the young woman who was rushed in after developing weakness in her left hand, the young man who woke up with right-sided weakness and a history of Sturge-Weber, the senior citizen who dropped his morning coffee and has trouble speaking, the grandparent who suddenly fell unconscious on his way to the airport. And this falls in line with our 20-40-40 RIR rule, which says that 20% should talk about your responsibilities, 40% should talk about your impact based on your stories and your data, and then 40% should talk about a reflection on why this matters. So you'll see in the beginning here, we talk about the responsibilities or what the student is doing. He determines stroke patient eligibility. He observes the stroke neurologist. That is what he does. Then you'll see there's a little bit of reflection, right? The physician's treating the patients. He learned that there's a greater appreciation for the relationship between healthcare and research. And now here's where we get into a ton of impact. There are many stories here. The Broca's aphasia, that's a story. This is a story of the young woman. Essentially all these stories that we went through earlier are all evidence of impact Then he closes it off with a little bit more reflection here on how neurologists considered each patient's individual circumstance. So you'll see here, roughly, it matches the 20-40-40, 20% responsibilities, 40% impact, and then 40% reflection. This is far different than the experience in the year prior, where it was a majority, 80% plus, of just blue responsibilities. If you take away nothing else, remember from that extracurricular what not to do. Here are the 4 things that pre-meds incorrectly focus on and consequentially get wrong about their work and activities. Number 1, don't get fooled by the vanity metrics like the hours or the experience name or the leadership title. This experience had 408 hours. It was called the Student Stroke Team Clinical Research Assistant. It was all fancy, but it wasn't effective. And remember that simple works and fancy hurts. Number 2, don't just reiterate what your clinical experience is. If you're spending 3, 4, 5 sentences just describing the responsibilities of a scribe or an EMT, you're wasting your time because we already know what those volunteers do. Remember the 20-40-40 RIR rule. 20% should be about your responsibilities or what you do. 40% should be about your impact or your stories and the data that only you can share. And the last 40% should be about reflection, why it matters, and how you grew from that experience. Number 3, telling or trying to convince the reader instead of just showing them. For example, at the end of that extracurricular, you'll see that he writes, "I gained a greater appreciation for the role of research in medicine." Not only is that far too broad, it's hard to believe because none of the other sentences refer at all to any of the research he did while in that extracurricular. And the largest mistake, when you share primarily what you hope to do instead of focusing on what you have done already. This is like when I tell my friends I'm going to lose 30 pounds. Would you believe me more if over the last 3 months I had already lost 30 pounds and I needed to lose 30 more? Or if over the last 3 months I actually gained 5 pounds and this is going to be my first time trying to lose 30. The same is with the work and activities section. Focus on what you have accomplished because that's real, that's tangible, and no one can take that away from you. Anyone can hope and tell you what they will do, but there's no proof there, so that won't stand out. Everything we know from the application cycle comes from studying real applications. And so if you want to know exactly what it takes to get into medical school, look at the 8 full medical school applications here in our application database. It features applications that got into schools like UCSF, UCSD, and my own application that got me into UCLA. Always free, link in bio, application database. Experience number 2, hospital volunteering that earned interviews at their state schools. To start, remember that the only 2 things that influence a work and activities section's quality is the quality of the extracurricular itself and how well you write about it. A couple of hints here immediately that this extracurricular is lower quality. For one, look at the completed hours, only 116 with 250 anticipated. That means 2-to-1 ratio, they've only finished a third of their projected total hours. If you've only finished a third of the hours you're looking to complete, you likely don't have all the stories, all the data, all the impact, all the reflections that would make this writing effective. Second, you'll see in the title that this is a bedside volunteer experience. In other words, it's your run-of-the-mill hospital volunteer experience. And to be clear, that's okay. We need to get our clinical experience someplace, but I don't want you relying on this clinical experience alone to get you into medical school. It won't be the most memorable part of your application just because it is so commonplace. Now, let's take a look at the writing itself. You'll see that the writer does this beautiful job of inviting the reader into this 10th birthday party that she curates for Sally. And it follows the 20-40-40 RIR rule very well. There's maybe one sentence here that describes her responsibilities, but honestly is also a part of the story where she decorates her room with banners, balloons, and bouquets of flowers. Then there's a ton more sentences on just the story and the impact that she had on Sally. The decorations, the seeing her being wheeled back with a clear smile into her transformed room, the singing happy birthday and seeing that it looks like she had forgot about her cancer just for a moment. And we bring it home with many sentences of reflection, feeling grateful to bring her childhood back to her life, even if just for briefly. Being able to restore that part of her life emphasizes why practicing medicine is a gift. Patients are not simply their diagnoses. A simple sentence with a strong message, a strong impact. They are people first. So again, you can see that the 20-40-40 here works pretty well, and you end up with a strong, well-written extracurricular. So this is a well-written clinical experience, but it only gets to our number 2 slot, because how well you write an experience is not the only thing that dictates its quality. There is a ceiling, and you are limited by the inherent quality of the extracurricular itself. You can take average or mediocre clinical experience extracurriculars and write about them well. Heck, you can write about them perfectly. But you will run into a ceiling where you can't improve it because there's just not much more to say. The easiest and best way to have a compelling work and activities section is to work on it 3 or 4 years in advance when you're choosing which extracurriculars and you're building impact in them. Remember, if you build Khan Academy, the writing almost does itself. It becomes almost impossible to mess up. If you remember nothing else about this extracurricular, remember that you cannot make chicken salad from chicken shit. But wait, we still have 2 stronger clinical experiences to share. Experience number 3, ophthalmic technician that earned interviews at Stanford, Georgetown, and Tufts. Now we're looking at what happens when you pair a high quality clinical experience with high quality writing. You can see immediately when we break down the responsibilities, impact, reflections, that this is a very well-balanced extracurricular. Again, really hitting that 20-40-40 rule. There's a story here about prior authorizations where he, the medical assistant, not the patient, not the doctor themselves, but the medical assistant had to be the one fighting with insurance companies to try and get this patient the medication that they needed. And he makes it clear that there are stakes. If he doesn't do this, then the patient just does not get the medication they need, and that risks postponing surgeries in the future, risks losing their sight just because of insurance obstruction. This clinical experience has some of my favorite reflection. For example, experiencing these moments made me wonder why insurance companies, not physicians, dictate medical care. Or another example, working in healthcare has exposed me to systemic issues, revealing that the current system needs a revolution beyond my control. Instead of just the one single patient encounter in the previous extracurricular, this one is written with 1,200 hours of experience with 1,500 anticipated hours to come. And as a reader, what do you take away from this experience? I see someone who understands his role in a team. The buzzword version of that is works well in teams. I see someone who understands what happens when patients don't receive the healthcare that they need. They don't take the prescription medications they need. They postpone the surgeries that they need. And the buzzword description of that is experience with underserved populations. The most common question I get from premeds is, how do I demonstrate XYZ quality? How do I show them that I'm passionate about the underserved? Or how do I show them that I'm empathic? Or how do I show them that I am a leader? And you're seeing here in this extracurricular that all of these buzzwords and all of these phrases are just condensed versions of the high quality stories and reflections in your writing. If you take care of the writing and you convey the impact and you convey the reflection, naturally you will stand out to admissions committees. That extracurricular tells us exactly the 3 things you need to have to stand out when you're writing your clinical experience extracurricular. Number 1, you must demonstrate an understanding of the patient-physician experience. What is it like to be a patient who gets sick, has to wait 3 months for an appointment, gets prescribed a medication, but takes 3 weeks for a medical assistant, not the patient, not the doctor, but 3 weeks for the medical assistant to fight with insurance to get you the medication you deserve. Number 2, it shares a connection with one patient or one community of patients that you know well. If you're writing things like countless individuals, or you're broadly referring to all the patients that you cared for, it's not specific enough. Number 3, it makes the reader feel like you have the capacity to be a good listener or an active participant in their health. In other words, you're looking for traits that show that that writer would be able to take care of you or your loved ones with grace. But that's not the strongest clinical experience extracurricular I've seen. We have one last one, and this experience got interviews at Mayo, Einstein, Cornell, and Kaiser. A ton of tuition-free medical schools. Experience number 4, medical assistant. This is one of the strongest clinical experiences I've ever seen. It couples a high quality experience with higher quality writing. And together, it paints the picture of a highly engaged, highly mature pre-med who is experienced with working with vulnerable patients in emotionally charged situations. First, let's take a look at the hours. 1,600 completed and 1,200 more to come. Again, this just gives you a foundation of experiences. You'll inevitably have patient stories. You'll inevitably have data to lean back in to convey the level of impact you've had over 1,600, nearly 2,800 hours. I'm not saying that you have to do 3,000 hours of clinical experience for it to be impactful, but I am saying that it's less likely that you'll have the data, the stories, the impact if you've done 200 hours as opposed to 2,000. Next, I want you to appreciate just how short the responsibility sentence is. In fact, it's only this one sentence. I ring patients, take vitals, histories, and fill out soap notes. We all know what medical assistants do, and this is a medical assistant position, and he gets straight to the meat after one single responsibility sentence. Here's a breakdown, the 20-40-40 responsibilities, impact, reflection. Now, let's dive deeper into some of my favorite patient stories. I love some of these details and just how he humanizes this patient, Greg. Greg had intractable lower back pain, and many doctors and many healthcare workers will call this patient population pain med seekers, drug seekers, that they're faking their pain. But instead of all that, the pre-med humanizes Greg, calls him an avid runner, someone who really just wants to comfortably walk his dog. This level of specificity and relatability lets you see Greg in your own mind. He's just that average Joe on the sidewalk who is walking his dog 65 pounds lighter that was before the spine surgery. And then you can see he connects with Greg through his own weight loss journey of losing over 50 pounds after joining a swim club. So many pre-meds complain to me that they aren't able to have an impact because their role in the healthcare team is so limited. I don't get to do anything is one of the most common reasons I hear. And there's two huge lessons to learn here. One, the writer has 1,600 hours logged in this experience. He has put in his time to earn those vulnerable, emotionally charged situations. And two, he's connecting with the patient in a way that we all can. He's not scrubbing in and handing sterile instruments to the surgeon. He's simply sharing his own experience and helping the patient by Googling pools and swimming programs near him. Please do not get it twisted. You are pre-med. Your time will come when you scrub into surgeries and help out the surgeons. Your time will come when you diagnose a patient and offer treatment plans. That time is not now, and it is not what we're looking for in your written application. So make sure you're not optimizing for the wrong thing and learn from Greg's story. And Greg's story is only the first of two in this work and activities section. So let's now jump into the second story with Finn, this 18-year-old kid who had slipped back into opiate addiction after being clean for 6 months. Again, I just love how relatable this is. They're laughing, joking, sharing summer plans together. They both share a love of Elvis and are pretty much the exact same age. The only difference between Finn and the pre-med writer is that Finn is addicted to opioids. And personally, this is one of my favorite haunting quotes because the pre-med was there in that vulnerable situation, trusted by Finn, because this quote is just so real. Finn goes, "I don't think I'm strong enough to start over." And it's the level of specificity in that quote that just helps you relate and be a part of that experience and believe the writer. It makes you feel like the writer is mature and a great listener and proactive in this relationship with Finn. And that's all the writer does. It's this pure form of medicine outside of drugs, outside of surgery. It's one of active listening and inspiring confidence and being a pillar of support for the patient. In both scenarios, he is highly engaged. He goes so far to research actual swimming pools with the patient, and he's involved with this vulnerable, emotionally charged situation where Finn, an 18-year-old, is struggling through an opiate addiction. These scenarios convey his maturity, his proactivity, his comfort in very difficult health situations. It's only October and he has 8 interviews lined up already. So those are 4 clinical experiences with 4 drastically different results. We go from an example that receives rejections from 30+ medical schools to a clinical experience that has earned 8 interviews by October. If this helped you, it might help one of your pre-med friends. Share it. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you soon.